Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval emergency fixes that became how we do things forever. A world where you're expected to solve immediate crises with whatever materials are lying around, convince entire communities that your rushed solution should become permanent law, navigate the egos of people who think panic is the same as planning, and somehow make all of that look like divine wisdom, instead of spectacular improvisation conducted at 3 in the morning while everything is on fire. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you.
Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a medieval port city in 1348, and something is catastrophically wrong. 3 days ago, a merchant ship arrived. Everyone was excited, naturally. Ships mean trade goods, exotic spices, stories from distant lands, profit. The docks erupted in the usual commercial chaos of prosperity arriving by sail, and human greed translated into aggressive haggling. Then people started coughing. Not the normal cough of someone who swallowed wrong or inhaled dock dust.
This cough had a quality that made other people step back instinctively, the way you step back from a stray dog that's growling in a pitch that suggests it has made decisions about your immediate future. You are a city official, which is a title that sounds impressive until you realize it means you're responsible for solving problems that no one has ever encountered before, using methods that do not yet exist. Your formal education consists of exactly nothing relevant to what is happening right now. You cannot read medical texts because medical texts are wrong about basically everything. You have no understanding of contagion beyond a vague awareness that being near sick people seems inadvisable.
But you do have one advantage: pattern recognition, enhanced by terror. Within 2 days of the ship's arrival, the coughing turned to fever. Within 4 days, someone died, then another, then 6 more. And every single person who got sick had one thing in common. They had been near that ship. They had touched cargo. They had spoken with sailors. They had breathed the same air as people who were now conspicuously deceased. The city council meets in emergency session, which is medieval government speak for everyone who normally argues about fish market regulations is now arguing about whether we're all going to die. The room is full of people performing confidence they absolutely do not feel. Shoulders are back, chins are up.
Eyes are wide with barely contained panic. The Merchant Guild representative speaks first, because Merchant Guild representatives always speak first when money is involved. The port must remain open, he says, with the certainty of someone whose income depends on being correct. Ships bring trade. Trade brings prosperity. You cannot close the port because some people got sick. People get sick all the time. This is normal. This is not normal, you say, and you can hear the tightness in your own voice. This is people dying in a very specific pattern that involves ships. Several council members nod. Others look skeptical.
One is visibly sweating despite the cool temperature, which you note with concern, because sweating is one of the symptoms, and if he's infected, then everyone in this room has been exposed, and this meeting may be inadvertently killing everyone present, which would be ironic but not helpful. "What do you propose?" asks the mayor, whose name is Antonio, and who has been mayor for 6 years, and has solved approximately 14 crises, and would very much like to stop solving crises and start governing peacefully, a goal that becomes less achievable with each passing day. You take a breath. What you are about to propose is either brilliantly preventative or economically catastrophic.
Possibly both. No more ships, you say. Any vessel that arrives stays offshore, 40 days. If no one dies, they can dock. If someone dies, they stay longer or they leave. The room explodes. Not literally, though given medieval luck with stored gunpowder, that's always a possibility. Merchants are shouting about lost revenue. The harbor master is explaining that ships cannot simply sit offshore indefinitely without resupply. A priest is suggesting prayer instead, which costs nothing and has the advantage of making everyone feel like they're helping without requiring difficult decisions. Why 40 days, someone demands. Why not 10? Why not wait until someone looks sick? You have no scientific answer.
40, you say carefully. In 40 days, someone who is going to die will die, and someone who is going to survive will survive. and we will know which category the ship falls into before we let them bring death to our docks. The vote is chaos. Hands go up, hands go down. Accusations of cowardice fly. Accusations of recklessness counter. Antonio counts votes twice because the first count seems impossible to believe.
The measure passes by exactly 2 votes, and you suspect one of those votes came from the sweating council member who has just realized he might be sick and would like to prevent others from experiencing what he's currently experiencing. The policy is implemented immediately. Ships arriving in port are met by harbor officials shouting instructions from shore. Sailors shout back, mostly variations of "you cannot be serious" and "this is financially devastating," and creative profanity in multiple languages. The ships sit offshore, visible from the city, close enough to taunt merchants with proximity, but too far to trade. You spend the next week lying awake at night, wondering if you just destroyed the city's economy over a hunch.
The merchants certainly think so. They've made their opinions very clear. Your house has been visited by several delegations, explaining in elaborate detail how your incompetence is ruining everything. Then one of the offshore ships reports a death, a sailor, previously healthy, now conspicuously not. Then another death. Then the entire crew is dying, and the ship just sits there like a floating tomb that proved you right in the most horrible way possible. Other ships complete their 40 days without incident. They dock safely. Trade resumes. The outbreak slows, then stops. The city survives. You have no idea why the policy worked.
You only know that it worked, which in medieval crisis management is as close to success as you ever get. The temporary emergency measure becomes permanent policy. Other cities hear about it and adopt it. 40 days becomes 40 giorni in Italian, which eventually becomes quarantine in multiple languages. The word spreads faster than the disease it was designed to prevent. What you created in that desperate council meeting will outlast empires. It will survive the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. It will be used against cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, Spanish flu, Ebola, COVID-19.
Scientists will eventually understand why it works: germ theory, incubation periods, asymptomatic transmission. But they will keep using the same basic system you invented while terrified and guessing, which is basically the medieval equivalent of your IT department's temporary fix that's been running critical systems for 11 years because replacing it would require admitting it was never meant to be permanent. This is what emergency fixes look like when they succeed: not elegant, not planned, not remotely perfect.
But functional enough to prevent immediate disaster, which makes them too valuable to question, which makes them permanent simply through the inertia of "this seems to be working, so let's not touch it." Tonight, we are walking through the moments when medieval people faced catastrophe with no preparation, invented solutions with no expertise, and accidentally created the infrastructure of modern civilization. Some of these you know: quarantine, bureaucracy, fire codes. Others will surprise you. All of them started the same way, with someone under pressure trying something desperate and hoping it didn't make everything worse. You are still standing in that council chamber, metaphorically, though physically you're walking home through evening streets. The ships are offshore, waiting their 40 giorni. The city is stabilizing. People are starting to believe the danger has passed, though you know better. This will happen again. Different disease, different ship, different decade. But when it does, someone will remember what you did here. They won't remember your name. They won't remember this meeting. They won't remember Antonio or the sweating council member or the merchant guild representative who fought you. They will simply implement quarantine as if it has always existed, as if it emerged fully formed from rational planning rather than desperate improvisation that happened to prevent enough deaths to seem like wisdom. This is your legacy. Not monuments, not glory. A system that persists because it was adequate when perfection was impossible. And centuries from now, a passenger will step off an airplane and be told they need to quarantine for 14 days, and they will complain loudly about the inconvenience, never knowing they're living inside a decision you made while terrified in 1348, hoping you weren't about to destroy everything while trying to save it. The emergency fix worked.
And like a temporary redirect in computer code that everyone's afraid to delete, it never went away. Someone is approaching. A messenger. There's been another incident. Something about a fire. You take a breath and prepare to invent another permanent system while pretending you know what you're doing. This, apparently, is what governance looks like. You are now in a different city, 15 years later, and everything is on fire. Not metaphorically on fire in the sense of problems are escalating, actually on fire in the sense of flames are consuming buildings and people are running while screaming. The merchant district is burning with the enthusiasm of wood that has been waiting its entire existence for this exact moment.
By dawn, 47 buildings are gone. 312 people are homeless. Approximately 7,000 pounds of trade goods have converted from assets into carbon and regret. The fire is out. The screaming has stopped. Now comes the aftermath, which turns out to be worse than the fire itself. Because now comes the question that will destroy more relationships than the fire destroyed buildings. Who owned what? You are standing in ruins 3 days after the fire, trying to mediate a dispute between two merchants who both claim to own the same warehouse foundation. Both are shouting. Both have witnesses. Neither has documentation, because documentation is for people who expect disasters, and optimism is more profitable than paranoia, right up until everything burns down. That was my warehouse, one merchant insists, a man named Giovanni who trades in wool and has the aggressive confidence of someone who has never been poor. I stored 50 bolts of English cloth there. Someone owes me compensation. That was my warehouse, counters Leonardo, a silk trader with the desperate energy of someone whose entire livelihood just converted to ash. I had 20 bolts of silk, 50 pounds of spices, 3 chests of Venetian glassware, all verified by... He trails off because he cannot complete that sentence. Nothing was verified. Nothing was recorded. Everything existed in memory, in verbal agreements, in handshake deals that worked perfectly well when buildings were standing, but which become completely useless the moment everything turns to smoke and competing memories. You are the city administrator, which is a position that sounds bureaucratic and boring until a disaster occurs, and then suddenly you're responsible for resolving disputes that have no resolution because no one wrote anything down. 3 different people claim ownership of the same plot of land. 7 different merchants insist they had goods stored in a warehouse that was definitely not large enough to hold all those goods, unless someone had access to spatial magic, which seems unlikely but cannot be disproven without records. Everyone is lying, or exaggerating, or genuinely confused. You have no way to distinguish truth from convenient fiction. The arguments escalate. Shoving occurs. Someone throws a punch. You realize, standing in the ashes, that the fire destroyed buildings, but the lack of records is destroying the community from inside. That evening, you sit with the city council and make a proposal that everyone will hate, but no one can argue against after today's chaos. From now on, you say slowly, everything gets written down. Property ownership, documented. Business agreements, documented. Stored goods, documented. Sales, documented. Loans, documented. If it matters, if it might be disputed later, if it involves value or obligation or ownership, there will be a record that exists outside human memory. The council members look at each other with expressions ranging from resigned acceptance to active hostility. Documentation costs money. Someone has to pay clerks. Someone has to buy parchment, which is expensive because it involves killing animals and scraping their skin and treating it with chemicals that smell like institutional regret. Someone has to store records, protect them from fire and water and rats, and the general decay that affects everything medieval. But the alternative is the chaos happening outside right now. The alternative is another fire, another disaster, another cascade of disputes that tears the community apart.
A merchant named Paolo objects immediately. This is government overreach, he says, which is apparently a complaint that transcends centuries. You're interfering with private business. Records are expensive.
Small traders cannot afford this. Small traders also cannot afford to lose everything with no proof it existed, you counter. Records protect everyone, including you. Paolo is not convinced. Paolo will remain unconvinced until his own business experiences a disaster, at which point he will suddenly become a passionate advocate for documentation. This is how humans work. Opposition to safety measures continues right up until the moment those measures would have prevented personal catastrophe. The policy passes. The city hires clerks, creating a new profession for people with good handwriting and the patience to listen to merchants describe property boundaries for 45 minutes. These are not prestigious positions. They are tedious, underpaid jobs that involve sitting at desks turning human chaos into organized information, but they are essential. And over months, something changes. The system works. When the next dispute arises, someone produces a record. The argument ends immediately. No shouting, no violence, just documentation proving who owned what and when. Tax records follow because the city needs to know who owes what and who has paid. Census records appear because officials need to track who is alive, who died, who fled. Court records multiply because judges benefit from referencing previous decisions instead of reinventing justice every time someone files a complaint. The medieval clerk becomes a strange new type of professional.
Not a craftsman making physical objects, not a merchant moving goods, not a laborer building structures. They sit at desks copying information, creating redundant records, filing documents in organizational systems that seem absurdly complex for what they accomplish. But what they accomplish is preventing chaos. And chaos prevention, while invisible when successful, is worth every penny when the alternative is visible disaster. You watch this system develop and realize something uncomfortable. The emergency measure is working too well to ever be removed. Once records exist, people rely on them. Once systems are documented, changing them requires paperwork, which means the system perpetuates itself through its own complexity.
Bureaucracy is self-reinforcing. This is not efficiency. This is not innovation. This is trauma response hardening into tradition, which is basically how most medieval institutions developed. A year later, you walk through the rebuilt merchant district. Every building now has documented ownership. Every major transaction creates a record. Disputes still occur, but they resolve faster because evidence exists beyond competing memories. The city functions more smoothly not because people are better, but because the infrastructure of memory extends beyond individual humans. And you think about how this started. A fire, a crisis, desperate shouting in ruins.
And now, rooms full of clerks, shelves full of records, an entire administrative apparatus that will outlast everyone currently alive. Fast forward 700 years. You fill out forms for everything. Want to buy property? Forms. Start a business? Forms. Get married? Forms. Die? Surprisingly, more forms. Government employment includes millions of people whose entire job is processing, filing, managing information that exists to prove other information exists. The bureaucracy is slow. The forms are confusing. The requirements feel arbitrary. Nothing about modern paperwork feels natural or necessary. It feels like punishment for the crime of participating in civilization.
But it exists because medieval cities learned that memory fails during crisis, that verbal agreements dissolve into violence when everything burns, that writing things down was the only solution that prevented complete social collapse. The emergency fix was never meant to be elegant. It was only meant to work. And it worked well enough that removing it became unthinkable. Who would volunteer to return to the chaos of undocumented reality? Who would argue for fewer records after experiencing the alternative? So the clerks continued copying. The records continued accumulating.
The system continued expanding, consuming more activities, demanding documentation for increasingly granular aspects of life, until the act of recording became as important as the act being recorded. which is basically the medieval equivalent of your company's temporary database that now contains 17 years of critical data and cannot be replaced without destroying everything. You stand in the records room watching a clerk file property documents. The fire was 5 years ago. The rebuilt district is thriving. No one remembers the chaos of undocumented ownership because documentation prevented it from recurring. This is bureaucracy's origin story, not a love of order for order's sake, not a passion for complexity.
Just a terrified response to disaster that became permanent because it prevented the next disaster. The emergency fix worked, and like a code patch that's too scary to remove, it never went away. A messenger arrives with news of another incident. This one involves livestock and a market square, and something about a bull. You gather the documentation tools that didn't exist 15 years ago and prepare to create records of whatever disaster is currently unfolding, because that's what you do now. You document chaos so it doesn't have to be remembered, which means it can be resolved instead of argued about. Somewhere, a clerk is copying this interaction. The record will outlast the memory. The system perpetuates. History doesn't repeat, but it does get filed in triplicate. You are in a walled city in 1410, and the city is about to be attacked. Scouts report an enemy army 2 days away, moving fast, carrying siege equipment and what appears to be significant optimism about their chances. Your city has approximately 48 hours to prepare a defense that will determine whether everyone inside survives or becomes a historical footnote involving words like massacre and unfortunate. The problem is not courage. Your guards are willing to fight. The problem is not walls. Your walls are adequate, at least theoretically.
The problem is coordination, which turns out to be significantly more difficult than anyone expected when they were designing cities without considering the logistical challenges of synchronized panic. The city guard is supposed to assemble at dawn to begin fortifying gates and positioning defensive equipment. Dawn, everyone agrees, is when this will happen. Dawn seems like a clear enough time reference. The sun comes up. Everyone knows when that is. Simple. Except dawn means different things to different people, and those differences accumulate into catastrophic delays when every minute counts. Some guards arrive when the sky starts lightening, which happens approximately an hour before sunrise.
Others arrive when the sun breaks the horizon, which is technically dawn but practically quite late if you're the person who arrived an hour ago and has been waiting in increasingly annoyed silence. A few interpret dawn as sometime in the morning and arrive 2 hours late, looking confused about why everyone is angry at them specifically when they clearly showed up during morning, which is when dawn happens. By the time the full guard is assembled, 3 hours have passed, 3 hours during which no defensive work occurred because coordination requires everyone present simultaneously. This happens again at midday, again at evening.
Every shift change, every assembly, every coordinated task is delayed by people operating on personal time references that align roughly never. Some people's noon is other people's mid-afternoon. Evening could mean sunset, or could mean when I feel like stopping work, which varies by personality and motivation. You are the captain of the guard, which is a position that sounded impressive when you accepted it, but which primarily involves herding armed people who have strong opinions about when times of day begin. And you are staring at a terrifying realization. This city might fall not because of weak walls or inadequate weapons, but because no one can agree on when to show up. During an emergency planning meeting, someone proposes a solution that sounds deceptively simple: the church bell. It already rings for religious services. What if it rings for everything? What if specific bell patterns mean specific times, and everyone agrees to operate on bell time instead of personal interpretation time? This is revolutionary, in the same way that suggesting everyone drive on the same side of the road is revolutionary.
So we ring bells, says Marcus, your second in command, a man who has the physique of someone who lifts heavy objects professionally and the facial expression of someone who regrets every life choice that led to this meeting. And people just show up when bells happen? Yes, you say.
even if they don't feel ready, approximately 46 hours away, and philosophical debates about personal freedom versus collective coordination will have to wait until after the siege.
Bells will ring at fixed intervals: morning bell, work bell, meal bell, shift change bell, emergency bell. Each pattern is distinct, or at least as distinct as you can make bells sound when bells have limited expressive range. Guards are informed. When the morning bell rings, you assemble. Not when dawn looks right to you personally, not when you finish breakfast, not when you feel spiritually prepared for defensive work. When the bell rings. The first day is chaos. People miss bells. People misinterpret bells. Someone shows up for the morning assembly during the meal bell and gets angry when no defensive planning happens.
Another person insists the shift change bell sounded exactly like the emergency bell and wants to know why everyone is mad at him for panicking unnecessarily. But slowly, something changes. The second day, more people arrive together. The third day, assemblies happen with something resembling coordination. The guards start arriving simultaneously. Work parties form without extended waiting. Shift changes happen cleanly, with the departing shift actually departing when the arriving shift actually arrives, which is a miracle of timing that previously occurred roughly never. The gates get fortified, the walls get manned properly.
Supply distribution becomes efficient because everyone shows up when supplies are actually available, instead of wandering over whenever they remember supplies exist. The entire defensive preparation accelerates because shared time reference creates shared action. The enemy army arrives to find a city prepared with suspicious competence. The siege begins. For 3 weeks, the attackers probe defenses, launch assaults, attempt breaches. For 3 weeks, the city responds with coordinated precision. Guards change shifts reliably. Supply deliveries arrive on schedule. Defensive positions remain consistently manned because people actually show up when they're supposed to show up. The siege fails. The army withdraws.
The city survives not through superior force, but through superior timing. You stand on the walls watching the enemy retreat and think about how close this was. Not militarily close, coordination close. If guards had continued arriving whenever dawn felt right to them personally, the defenses would have failed through confusion rather than combat. The bells do not stop ringing after the siege ends, because the system worked, because coordination persists in peacetime just as it matters in war, because once you synchronize human activity to external time signals, unsynchronizing it feels like deliberately choosing chaos. Craftsmen notice they can coordinate work better when everyone arrives simultaneously.
Markets establish opening and closing times. Guard shifts become predictable, which improves morale because people can plan their lives around fixed schedules. Curfews can be enforced uniformly because everyone agrees on when curfew means. The temporary emergency measure becomes permanent infrastructure. Other cities adopt bell time. Mechanical clocks are eventually invented to make the system more precise, because humans are never satisfied with adequate when obsessively accurate is possible. A guildmaster named Thomas approaches you months after the siege. He is a carpenter, responsible for training apprentices and coordinating workshop production. "This bell system," he says carefully, "we're using it for carpentry work."
Apprentices arrive together. Work coordinated. Production increased. That's good, you say, wondering where this is going. But the apprentices hate it, Thomas continues. They say bells control their lives. They want freedom to arrive when they're ready. You consider this. Do they want freedom more than they want effective training? Thomas pauses. That's what I told them. They're still complaining. They'll complain less when they're master carpenters who learned efficiently, you say. And then they'll implement the same system with their apprentices, and the cycle continues. This is exactly what happens.
Resistance continues for approximately 1 generation, then evaporates as children grow up, never knowing any system except bell time. To them, showing up when bells ring is simply how time works. The revolutionary becomes routine. The emergency becomes tradition. You think about all the ways this changed society: work discipline, productivity measurement, punctuality as a virtue.
The entire concept that being late is disrespectful emerged from the moment cities realized emergencies require synchronized response. Fast forward 600 years. Your phone alarm goes off at 6:30 a.m. You check the time constantly throughout the day. You have meetings scheduled to the minute. You measure productivity in hours.
You panic if you're late because lateness has social and professional consequences that your medieval ancestors accidentally invented while trying to avoid getting conquered during a siege. Time governs everything. School starts at fixed hours. Businesses operate on schedules. Transportation runs on timetables. Your entire life is segmented into time blocks, planned, scheduled, coordinated with others who are also living by external time references. And you rarely think about how strange this is, how humans lived for millennia without standardized time, how we organized around daylight and seasons and natural rhythms.
How the idea that everyone should wake at the same hour, work the same schedule, measure existence in uniform units was foreign, unnatural, imposed. But it worked during emergencies, and after emergencies passed, no one wanted to return to the chaos of personal time. Standard time was too useful for coordination, too effective for productivity, too embedded in how society functioned. The medieval city that invented this out of desperation could not imagine what they were creating. They thought they were solving a military problem.
They accidentally invented time discipline, which became the foundation of industrial capitalism, modern warfare, global logistics, and the entire concept of rush hour. Every clock you check, every deadline you meet, every time you synchronize with someone else's schedule, you're living inside that 1410 siege. The emergency fix worked, and like a temporary cron job that's been running your email server for 8 years, it never went away. You stand beneath the bell tower in 1430, 20 years after the siege, watching people organize their lives around chimes they once resented. Children play in the square, stopping when bells announce mealtime, resuming after.
Workers move in coordinated waves, their days structured by external signals. No one remembers the siege anymore. No one remembers the chaos of personal time. The bell system is simply how things work. Time has been standardized, and standardized time has structured society in ways that seem inevitable, but were actually invented desperately by someone who needed everyone to show up at the same fucking time for once. The emergency fix worked. It solved the immediate problem, and then it solved every subsequent coordination problem, which made removing it unthinkable. History doesn't repeat, but it does ring bells at precise intervals until everyone's lives run on schedules. A messenger arrives, another incident.
This time involving streets and hygiene and something about plague. You prepare to invent another system that will accidentally shape civilization, because apparently that's your job now. Emergency infrastructure creation, one permanent fix at a time. The bells ring, the city moves. Time continues. You are walking through a medieval city in 1450, and the smell hits you before anything else. Not the pleasant smell of baking bread or market spices, or even horse manure, which at least has the decency to smell agricultural. This is the smell of everything organic that humans produce when they treat streets like nature's garbage disposal system, which is to say, every medieval street ever.
Medieval streets served multiple purposes simultaneously, and waste management was enthusiastically included in that list. People walked there, traded there, worked there, and disposed of literally everything there. Household trash, animal droppings, butcher scraps that used to be animals and are now ambiguous organic matter, human waste from chamber pots emptied out windows with the cheerful warning "Gardez-vous," which is French for watch out for water, but really means I'm about to ruin your morning. You had approximately 2 seconds to move, maybe 3 if the person upstairs felt generous. Rain was supposed to wash this away. Rain, it turns out, was not particularly interested in urban sanitation.
Rain would show up, move waste from one location to another location, and then leave, feeling accomplished, while the waste remained, just differently distributed. This was simply accepted. Cities smelled. Life smelled. You got used to it, or you didn't. But either way, the waste remained, because no one had a better solution. And besides, where else would you put it? Outside the city? That's where the farms are. In the river? That's where the drinking water comes from. Sometimes, when people remembered not to dump things upstream. For most of the Middle Ages, this system worked in the sense that it didn't immediately kill everyone, which is a low standard, but the only standard medieval infrastructure generally achieved.
The neighborhoods that maintain some minimal level of cleanliness are experiencing death at merely concerning rates rather than catastrophic rates. No one understands bacteria. Germ theory won't be invented for another 400 years. But you don't need to understand microbiology to notice that filth and death seem to travel together, like a couple that's codependent in extremely unhealthy ways. You present your findings to the city council, which is increasingly just you presenting problems and them looking tired. The waste, you say, gesturing at diagrams that show death rates by neighborhood. It correlates with illness.
Where waste accumulates, people die faster. A council member named Pietro objects immediately. People die everywhere. This is plague. God sends plague. You cannot prevent divine will by sweeping streets. I can't prevent divine will, you agree. But I can maybe reduce the speed at which divine will manifest in this specific city if we remove the waste that seems to help divine will work more efficiently. Pietro looks unconvinced.
Pietro will remain unconvinced until his own neighborhood experiences an outbreak, at which point his theology will become suspiciously flexible regarding the relationship between cleanliness and divine intent. The council passes emergency sanitation orders with the enthusiasm of people who don't want to do this, but want dying even less. Orders are issued. Residents are commanded to clear refuse from in front of their homes and businesses, not asked, commanded, with fines and inspections, and the very real threat of being blamed if your accumulated waste contributes to your neighbor's death. People hate this immediately, which you expected. Medieval people have strong opinions about being told what to do, and those opinions are generally variations of, no thank you, I prefer autonomy, even if autonomy means living in filth. A baker named Giuliano complains loudly, I don't have time to clean streets, I'm busy, running a business, making bread, essential services. Making bread in a city full of corpses is less profitable than making bread in a city where customers remain alive, you point out. That's not my problem. It will absolutely become your problem when there's no one left to buy bread. Fines are imposed. People who dump waste improperly are charged increasingly large amounts. Repeat offenders face steeper penalties that escalate from annoying to financially devastating. Entire streets are ordered to coordinate cleaning days, which involves everyone simultaneously dealing with months or years of accumulated waste that has achieved structural integrity through sheer density. The smell during these cleanups is legendary. People describe it as breathing through a liquefied cemetery. Some workers wrap cloth around their faces, which doesn't help but makes them feel like they're doing something. The waste is carted outside the city and dumped in designated areas that immediately become the worst places in a 30-mile radius. But it works. Neighborhoods that remove waste see fewer outbreaks. The smell lessens from unbearable to merely terrible, which counts as improvement. Insects, those reliable harbingers of decay, find fewer reasons to congregate. Rats, the extremely effective plague distribution systems with tails, discover that waste-free streets are less interesting. People stop dying quite as fast. And once something reduces death, even slightly, it becomes very difficult to argue against. Over time, emergency cleanups become routine. The city hires workers specifically to remove waste. These are not prestigious positions. These are jobs for people with limited options and strong stomachs, who are willing to spend their days handling everything no one else wants to touch. They are underpaid, undervalued, and absolutely essential. Infrastructure follows. Gutters are dug to channel waste away from living areas. Those gutters evolve into covered channels. Covered channels become underground systems. Collection schedules are established.
Waste management transforms from throw it in the street and pray to organized removal by people whose job is making filth disappear. You watch this system develop and realize you are witnessing a fundamental shift. Cities are taking responsibility for waste in a way they never did before. This isn't about individual cleanliness.
This is collective infrastructure, acknowledging that shared spaces require shared maintenance. A woman named Katerina, who manages a cloth dyeing business, stops you in the market months later. "The cleanup system," she says, "it's working. My street smells less like death. My workers are healthier. Thank you." You are surprised because you've grown accustomed to complaints rather than gratitude. "You're welcome," you manage. Though the waste workers still need to be paid more, Katerina continues, because gratitude in medieval times is never without critique. They're performing essential work.
They should be compensated accordingly. "I'll mention it to the council," you say, knowing the council will respond with elaborate explanations about budget limitations that somehow never apply when funding monuments or official banquets. Today, you take clean streets for granted. Garbage trucks arrive on schedule with the reliability of death and taxes. Storm drains channel rainwater away from streets. Sewage systems carry waste far from living areas through elaborate underground networks that represent centuries of accumulated infrastructure. Sanitation workers, still often undervalued, perform the essential task of making filth invisible. Without them, cities would become unlivable within weeks, medieval levels of unlivable.
Streets as open sewers unlivable. All of this traces back to plague cities, desperately trying to stop death by removing rot. They didn't understand why it worked. They only understood that dirty neighborhoods died faster and clean neighborhoods died slower, and that correlation was enough to make sanitation permanent. The medieval innovation wasn't inventing cleanliness. Cleanliness existed in private homes, in religious contexts, in personal hygiene to varying degrees. The innovation was making cleanliness a public responsibility enforced by authority rather than individual choice. Before plague, your waste was your problem. After plague, your waste was everyone's problem, and everyone had the authority to make you deal with it.
This is the uncomfortable truth about public sanitation. It exists because visible decay correlates with human death, and societies that remove decay survive longer than societies that embrace it. The correlation became causation only later, when science explained bacteria and disease vectors and all the ways filth transmits illness. But the system was already in place by then, built by terrified officials who noticed patterns and acted on them without understanding the mechanisms. You stand in the market square in 1455, 5 years after the emergency orders, watching the morning waste collection. Workers move methodically, removing yesterday's accumulation before the market opens. The process is routine now, unremarkable. The city functions with a level of cleanliness that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. The plague still exists, disease still kills, but the worst outbreaks have slowed. The correlation between waste and death remains visible enough that maintaining cleanliness continues being prioritized even as the immediate crisis fades from memory. This is how emergency measures become permanent infrastructure. They work just well enough to prevent the worst outcomes, which makes removing them seem recklessly dangerous. Every time you walk down a clean sidewalk, every time garbage disappears overnight, every time drains carry away rainwater instead of flooding streets with contaminated runoff, you are benefiting from medieval people learning through catastrophic death rates that rot and civilization should not occupy the same space. The emergency response became permanent infrastructure. The desperate hygiene measures became modern sanitation systems. The temporary cleanup became perpetual maintenance. And somewhere, in every city, sanitation workers continue the work that started during plague emergencies, removing waste.
Making filth disappear, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that keeps streets from smelling like death, which is basically the medieval equivalent of your DevOps team maintaining critical systems that no one notices until they stop working. The emergency fix worked. It made cities survivable rather than merely habitable, and like a critical service that everyone depends on but no one wants to fund properly, it never went away. A messenger arrives. Another incident.
this time involving fire. Again, you prepare to invent fire codes.
Because apparently, medieval cities are just an endless series of disasters waiting for someone to create permanent solutions while pretending those solutions are temporary. You are standing in London in 1212, watching the city burn. Again. This is the third major fire in 15 years, and you are beginning to suspect there might be a pattern. Medieval cities and fire had a relationship that can best be described as enthusiastically destructive partnership. Wood buildings packed tightly together, thatched roofs made of dried grass that basically wanted to burn, narrow streets that funneled wind like architectural wind tunnels designed by someone who hated cities, open flames for cooking, heating, lighting, no fire departments.
No water pressure, no fire extinguishers, just buckets and hope, and the general awareness that when fire started, you ran. The combination was less if fire happens, and more when enthusiastically happens again. A single spark could erase an entire neighborhood. One careless hearth, one overturned candle, one baker who got ambitious with oven temperatures, which is surprisingly common because medieval bakers operated with the confidence of people who had never personally experienced catastrophic failure and assumed they never would. Flames jumped from roof to roof like they were training for the Olympics. People didn't evacuate calmly. They ran, screamed, tried to save items that were deeply replaceable, lost track of family members, and generally demonstrated that panic is not an effective organizational strategy. By the time fires burned themselves out, neighborhoods were gone, sometimes entire districts, sometimes a substantial portion of the city. The survivors would stand in the ashes wondering why this kept happening, as if the answer weren't, everything is made of extremely flammable materials in close proximity to constant fire sources. You are a city councilman, elected to govern, and you are staring at the third burned district in your tenure, wondering if maybe, possibly, this might be preventable. This is not a popular opinion. Most people treat fire as an act of God, unavoidable, something you pray about rather than plan around. But you are developing a theory, a controversial theory, a theory that will make you unpopular, but which seems increasingly obvious the more neighborhoods burn. The theory is this: maybe wooden buildings packed closely together with thatched roofs and constant fire sources is a design problem, not divine judgment. The city council meets in emergency session. Everyone looks tired. Someone's house burned down last week. Several people lost rental properties. The general mood is exhausted acceptance of inevitable disaster. Stone, you say into the silence, and tile.
Mandatory for new construction. The room reacts exactly as you expected. Outrage, accusations of overreach, complaints about cost. A merchant named Edward stands up with the aggressive posture of someone about to explain why you're wrong in elaborate detail. Stone costs 5 times what wood costs, Edward says. Tile roofs are heavy. They require different structural support.
You're essentially proposing that everyone rebuild using materials they cannot afford. Or, you counter, we can rebuild with wood and thatch, wait 5 years, and have this conversation again while standing in different ruins. That's fear-mongering. That's pattern recognition. You produce records, because by now the city has records, thanks to the previous emergency fix that created bureaucracy. 3 major fires in 15 years, average of 400 buildings destroyed per fire, 63 deaths total, economic losses approaching £100,000, which is an amount so large it makes the council members physically flinch. Someone does public math. Mandating stone and tile for new construction would cost approximately £20,000 spread across all building owners. Preventing 1 fire would save £80,000 in damages. Preventing 3 fires would save the city's entire economy from periodic destruction. The math is compelling. The math suggests that prevention is cheaper than repetition, which is apparently a revolutionary concept in 1212. The vote passes narrowly. New construction must use stone or brick. Roofs must be tile or slate. Thatched roofs are banned in the city center. Buildings must be spaced apart with gaps between them, giving fires fewer opportunities to socialize with neighboring structures. People hate it immediately.
Builders hate it because stone is difficult to work with. Property owners hate it because construction costs increased dramatically. Everyone complains that regulations are oppressive, expensive, and ruin the character of London's traditional architecture, which was apparently flammable and frequently destroyed. But slowly, over decades, the city changes. Stone buildings rise where wooden ones burned. Tile roofs spread like a practical infection. Fire breaks appear in the urban fabric, interrupting the continuous combustible surface that previously allowed fires to travel efficiently. And fires, while still dangerous, stop consuming entire districts with the same enthusiasm. They still happen, they still destroy, but they're smaller.
More contained, less catastrophic. A fire in 1240 destroys 20 buildings instead of 400. A fire in 1255 is extinguished before jumping streets. The regulations are working through sheer material resistance to combustion. The Great Fire of London in 1666 will test this system thoroughly and find it partially effective. 13,000 houses will burn over 4 days, which sounds catastrophic until you realize that's less than half the city, and the death toll will be remarkably low because stone buildings, while they burn, don't collapse as quickly as wooden ones. The regulations created after 1212 won't prevent the Great Fire, but they will prevent it from being total extinction.
Partial destruction instead of complete annihilation counts as success in medieval disaster management. After 1666, fire codes will become even stricter. Chimney inspections will be mandated. Building materials will be heavily regulated. Spacing requirements will be enforced with legal penalties. The entire profession of firefighting will develop because coordinated response beats panicked bucket brigades.
All of it traces back to medieval cities rebuilding after disasters and reluctantly admitting that maybe, possibly, learning from repeated catastrophic failures is better than accepting them as inevitable. Today, you live inside building codes descended from medieval fire regulations that were created by people tired of watching everything burn. Your house must meet fire safety standards. Your workplace has sprinkler systems, fire exits, fire alarms, fire extinguishers, and probably at least one person who treats the fire alarm as a brake signal rather than an emergency warning. Construction materials are tested for fire resistance. Spacing between buildings is legally mandated.
Electrical systems are inspected. None of this exists because people love regulations. It exists because cities kept burning until someone got tired of it. You think of fire codes as safety measures. Medieval people thought of them as annoying interference with personal freedom right up until the next fire reminded them why the rules existed. Fire codes didn't make medieval cities safe. They made them survivable. They reduced total destruction to partial destruction, which is the best outcome medieval infrastructure generally achieved.
And every time a building inspection annoys you, every time you wonder why regulations are so strict, every time you're frustrated by safety requirements that slow construction, remember they exist because someone centuries ago watched their neighborhood burn and said, "Never again." Or at least, not as completely next time. The emergency fix worked. It didn't prevent fire. It prevented fire from winning quite so decisively.
Which is basically the medieval equivalent of your production server's failover system that you really hope you never need but keep maintained anyway, because total failure is worse than partial failure. You stand in the rebuilt London in 1230, 18 years after the fire, watching stone buildings rise where wooden ones stood. The city looks different, more permanent, less immediately flammable. People have stopped complaining about the regulations, mostly because the next generation has only known stone construction and assumes this is how cities have always been built. The emergency measure has become tradition. The desperate response has become standard practice.
And somewhere in the future, a building inspector will review plans and require additional fire safety measures, and the architect will complain about unnecessary complexity, never knowing they're arguing inside a system invented by medieval people who were exhausted from rebuilding the same city repeatedly. The emergency fix worked, and like a backup system that seemed excessive until you needed it, it never went away.
You are in Milan in 1374, and plague has returned. This is becoming a depressingly familiar pattern.
Plague arrives. People die in impressive numbers. The city panics. Authorities try various desperate measures that mostly don't work. The plague eventually burns itself out after killing approximately 30% of the population, and everyone spends the next generation dreading its return. This cycle has repeated 3 times in your lifetime. You are, frankly, tired of it. But this time, someone has an idea that is less medical breakthrough and more strategic relocation combined with aggressive optimism. The idea is this: what if, instead of letting sick people remain in their homes, where they enthusiastically spread disease to family members and neighbors and anyone who delivers food, we put them all in one place? Far from healthy people, staffed by people willing to risk exposure, which is to say people with limited options and strong religious convictions, equipped with basic supplies and absolutely minimal expectations regarding successful outcomes. This is how hospitals are born, not as healing centers, but as containment strategies, which is less inspiring but more honest. You are part of the City Health Committee, a group that didn't exist before plague and probably shouldn't exist now, but which continues existing because someone has to make decisions and everyone else is busy not volunteering. We need a pest house, you say during an emergency meeting, a building outside the walls.
For sick people. We already have churches for sick people, someone objects. They go there to pray. And then they go home and infect their families, you counter. I'm proposing we put them somewhere they can be sick away from people who aren't sick yet. That sounds like abandoning them. That sounds like preventing everyone else from joining them. The distinction is important. This isn't compassion. This is mathematics. 1 sick person in a family home infects 5 people. 1 sick person in isolation infects 0 people, or at least 0 additional people beyond whoever is caring for them. The first pest house is built outside the city walls, downwind.
In a location where no one important has to look at it or think about it or acknowledge its existence unless absolutely necessary. The architecture is utilitarian, in the sense that utilitarian means cheap and depressing. Large rooms, many beds, minimal privacy, no decorative elements except perhaps unintentional dampness. The goal is capacity, not comfort. This is a warehouse for sick people, designed to separate contagion from community. You are given responsibility for managing this facility, which is a position absolutely no one wanted, and which you accepted because someone has to, and it might as well be the person who suggested it. Your job is simple and terrible. Take in the sick, provide basic care, prevent spread, document who survives versus who doesn't. Try not to become sick yourself. Care is rudimentary. Patients are fed when food is available, which is most of the time, but not always. They receive water, assuming the wells are functioning. They are prayed over extensively by religious orders who believe faith is therapeutic, which costs nothing and makes everyone feel purposeful, even when it's medically irrelevant. Medical treatment ranges from mildly helpful to actively alarming.
Physicians recommend bloodletting, which removes blood from people who are already struggling, on the theory that bodies have too much blood and removing some will restore balance. This theory is incorrect but extremely popular. Herbal remedies are applied. Some actually help. Willow bark reduces fever. Chamomile aids sleep. Garlic does basically nothing for plague, but smells strong enough that people believe it's working, which is its own kind of medicine. But the real function of the hospital isn't curing disease, it's slowing its spread. If sick people are concentrated in one place, the rest of the city can keep functioning. Markets stay open, guards stay healthy, workshops continue operating.
The system survives even when individuals don't. This is brutal calculus, but it's effective calculus. Cities with pest houses see fewer uncontrolled outbreaks. The disease still spreads, but slower, more manageable, less apocalyptic. People are terrified of the pest house. Being sent there feels like exile combined with a death sentence. Families avoid it until they absolutely cannot care for sick members anymore. Once inside, patients are largely on their own,
tended by religious sisters and volunteers whose options in life were limited and who found purpose in caring for the dying. And yet, despite being designed as a containment facility with minimal expectations, something unexpected happens over time. Knowledge accumulates.
Caregivers notice patterns. They observe which practices help and which make things worse. Sister Margarita, who has been working in the pest house for 3 years and has somehow not gotten sick despite constant exposure, notices that patients who drink more water survive more often. She cannot explain why, but she starts insisting on hydration. Brother Antonio observes that ventilation seems to help. Rooms with windows opened have better survival rates than sealed rooms. He doesn't understand that fresh air dilutes infectious particles, but he understands that it works, and working is enough. Isolation, obviously, reduces spread. This is the original purpose, but the confirmation is valuable. These observations get shared.
Written down, because by now bureaucracy exists and everything gets documented. Other cities adopt the pest house model. The practices spread. Over decades, pest houses evolve. They become leprosariums for leprosy patients, sick houses for various infectious diseases, eventually general hospitals for all types of illness. The isolation model expands into the treatment model. By the Renaissance, hospitals are established institutions with specific purposes beyond containment. By the Enlightenment, they're becoming medical centers with actual therapeutic intent.
By the 20th century, they're equipped with technology medieval people couldn't imagine, staffed by trained professionals, designed for healing rather than warehousing the sick. Modern hospitals are clean, scientific, organized around recovery. They have antibiotics, surgery, diagnostic imaging, intensive care units. They represent centuries of accumulated medical knowledge and infrastructure investment. But their ancestor was a medieval building outside city walls where sick people were sent to die away from everyone else. Not elegant, not compassionate by modern standards, but effective enough at preventing total societal collapse that the model persisted. The emergency measure became permanent infrastructure.
The containment strategy evolved into healthcare. The desperate solution transformed into the foundation of modern medicine. You stand in the pest house in 1380, 6 years after it opened, watching Sister Margarita care for a patient. The patient is young, maybe 20, with the fever and swelling that suggest plague. Sister Margarita adjusts blankets, offers water, speaks quietly with the exhausted compassion of someone who has done this hundreds of times. The patient will probably die. Most of them do. But their family won't get sick. Their neighbors will remain healthy. The disease will be contained to this building instead of spreading through the entire neighborhood. This is the brutal mathematics of public health.
Sacrifice individual comfort for collective survival. Concentrate suffering to protect the healthy. Create spaces where death happens in organized ways so life can continue elsewhere. Today, when you visit a hospital, you're entering an institution born from plague containment. The building is nicer. The care is infinitely better. The technology is miraculous. But the basic concept remains. Sick people go to specialized places where they can be treated without spreading illness. Hospitals exist because medieval societies learned that separating sickness from daily life was the first step toward surviving epidemics. The emergency measure became permanent. The containment facility became healthcare infrastructure.
And every time you're grateful for medical care that helps rather than just isolates, remember it descends from a system designed primarily to keep your plague away from everyone else's not yet plague. The emergency fix worked, and like a quarantine protocol that seemed excessive until you needed it, it never went away. You are standing in a city square in 1450, and something is on fire, again. This seems to be a recurring theme in medieval urban life. This time it's a warehouse, flames enthusiastically consuming everything inside, and people are running in every direction, and approximately 15 different people are shouting contradictory instructions, and no one knows who to listen to.
Someone yells, "Form a bucket line." Someone else yells, "Evacuate immediately." A third person screams, "Save the grain."
A fourth suggests prayer might be more effective than action, which is not helpful but is very on brand for medieval emergency response. Everyone has opinions. No one has obviously recognizable authority. This is how people die during emergencies, not from the emergency itself, but from the chaos that emerges when everyone is in charge and simultaneously no one is in charge. You are the fire captain, which theoretically means you have authority to direct emergency response.
But you are wearing the same basic tunic and hose as everyone else, and in a crowd of terrified people running while screaming, you are visually indistinguishable from the person selling vegetables, or the blacksmith, or literally anyone else. By the time you establish authority through voice projection and aggressive proximity, 5 minutes have passed. The fire has spread to 2 adjacent buildings. 3 people have been injured trying to save goods from the warehouse because they didn't realize evacuation had been ordered. The bucket line formed, then collapsed when coordination failed because no one could identify who was actually directing it versus who was just enthusiastically participating in chaos.
After the fire is out, after the damage is assessed, after you've spent an hour explaining to the city council why the response was slower than optimal, you sit with the other emergency officials and make a proposal that seems almost offensively obvious. What if authority was visible, you say? The solution is uniforms, not elaborate costumes, not complex heraldry, simply distinct clothing that marks specific roles. Fire brigade wears red tunics, city guards wear blue, officials wear identifying sashes, messengers have distinctive caps. The specific details matter less than the principle. Authority should be recognizable without conversation. A council member named Leonardo objects. This seems unnecessary.
People know who the guards are. People know who the guards are when guards are standing still in daylight and you have time to look at their faces, you counter. During a fire at night when everyone is running, visual identification needs to be instant. So we spend money on special clothing. So we spend money once on clothing instead of repeatedly rebuilding structures that burned down while people argued about who was in charge. The proposal passes because the alternative is continued chaos, and chaos is expensive. Fire brigade members receive red tunics.
The color is chosen because red is visible and symbolically appropriate for fire-related work, and happens to be relatively easy to dye with madder root, which is cheaper than other pigments. City guards receive blue tunics. Blue dye from woad is even cheaper, which is convenient because there are more guards than firefighters. The color choice is economic before it's symbolic, but symbolism follows economy, and eventually no one remembers which came first. When the next fire breaks out 3 weeks later, the difference is immediate and dramatic. You arrive wearing your red tunic. People see you coming before you speak. They step aside.
They look to you for instructions before you've established authority through shouting. "Bucket line, east side," you call out. "Everyone else, clear the area." It happens, not perfectly, but faster than ever before. The bucket line forms with actual coordination. Evacuation proceeds with something resembling order. Roles are clear because roles are visible. This spreads quickly because the advantage is obvious. Guards can enforce curfews without stopping to prove their authority every 30 seconds. Medical practitioners wear identifying clothing so people know who to trust during plague outbreaks. Messengers have distinctive clothing so they can move through crowds without being stopped and questioned. Military uniforms follow.
Soldiers need to identify friendly versus enemy forces at distance during battle, which turns out to be important when everyone is wearing metal and covered in dirt, and visibility is limited by smoke and terrain. Guilds adopt uniforms for their members. Craft identification becomes instant. You can tell a mason from a carpenter from a blacksmith by their clothing, which facilitates commerce and prevents fraud. Of course, people resent uniforms immediately. They always have. Uniforms symbolize control, hierarchy, authority that cannot be argued with. Wearing a uniform means publicly accepting a role. Not wearing one when you're supposed to means facing consequences.
But during emergencies, resentment evaporates faster than water on hot stone. When fire breaks out, everyone wants clear instructions from someone who looks official. When riots start, citizens want to identify guards. When plague arrives,
People want to recognize medical authority without having to ask credentials during the crisis. Uniforms don't make authority wiser. They don't make officials more competent. They don't guarantee good decisions. They just make authority impossible to miss, which during chaos is often the difference between coordinated response and deadly confusion. A fire breaks out in 1465, 15 years after uniform adoption. You arrive in your red tunic.
People see you, immediately form a bucket line without being told, begin evacuating without argument. The fire is contained within 30 minutes. 1 building lost instead of 5. Later, a guard named Marco approaches you. The uniforms, he says, they work. People comply faster. But there's a problem. What problem? People impersonating guards, wearing blue tunics they're not authorized to wear, giving orders, causing problems. This is the inevitable consequence of visible authority. Once authority becomes recognizable, it becomes fakeable, and humans are excellent at exploiting systems for personal advantage. The city creates regulations about uniform use. Unauthorized uniform wearing becomes illegal.
Penalties are established. Enforcement mechanisms are developed. The system becomes more complex because humans are creative and rules must be correspondingly elaborate. But the core innovation persists. Authority remains visible. Roles remain clear. Emergency response remains faster than before uniforms existed. Today, uniforms still serve the same function: police, firefighters, paramedics, security, military. Their clothing signals authority, responsibility, expected behavior. You respond automatically. You step aside. You listen.
You comply, at least initially, because the uniform communicates role before any words are exchanged. This is all descended from medieval cities realizing that during emergencies, asking "Who are you?" wastes time people don't have. Visual identification shortcuts that delay. Uniforms didn't make authority legitimate, they made authority legible, and legible authority functions faster than invisible authority, which makes all the difference when buildings are burning and seconds matter.
Every time you see a police officer and instinctively recognize their role, every time you identify a firefighter in a crowd, every time uniform immediately communicates authority, you're experiencing a solution invented by medieval fire captains who were tired of establishing credentials while structures burned. The emergency fix worked. It made authority recognizable, and recognizable authority became permanent because invisible authority is effectively no authority at all during crisis, which is basically the medieval equivalent of your company's security badges that seemed unnecessary until that one incident where someone unauthorized accessed critical systems. The emergency fix worked. And like a visual identifier that seemed excessive until you needed it, it never went away. You are walking through a medieval city at dusk in 1480. The day is ending. Shops are closing. People are heading home. Lamps are being lit along streets that are cleaner than they were 30 years ago. The city is settling into evening routines that feel timeless, natural, inevitable. But nothing about this scene is natural. Everything you're seeing was invented desperately by someone under pressure. The bells ring, marking evening hour, standard time, invented during a siege when coordination meant survival. People respond automatically, their lives structured by external signals that once felt oppressive, but now feel normal.
Time is no longer personal, it's collective. And collective time is what makes cities function. The streets are clean, relatively speaking, based on filth accumulation. The emergency response that became permanent infrastructure. Buildings are stone and tile. Fire regulations enforced so routinely that no one remembers when wooden buildings were normal. The expensive solution that became mandatory after the third or fourth time entire districts burned. A sick person is being transported to the hospital outside the walls. The pest house, built for plague containment, that evolved into a treatment facility. Isolation that became healthcare. Guards in blue uniforms patrol the streets. Authority made visible during emergencies, now perpetually legible. The clothing that means you can give orders and people will listen. In the distance, the port sits quiet. Tomorrow, a ship will arrive, and wait offshore for quarantine inspection. 40 days, invented by someone who guessed and happened to guess correctly enough times that guessing became protocol. Records exist for everything: property ownership, business transactions, tax obligations. Bureaucracy, born from ash and chaos, now simply how cities remember things too important to trust to memory. You stand at the center of this city and realize nearly everything around you started as an emergency fix, desperate measures implemented under pressure, solutions that were supposed to be temporary, responses that were never meant to last, but they worked. And working solutions, even imperfect ones, tend to persist because replacing them would require admitting they were temporary, and by the time anyone thinks to replace them, they've become tradition, which is just emergency fixes that lasted long enough to seem intentional. This is how civilization actually develops, not through careful planning.
Not through wise foresight, not through committees and studies and rational design, through crisis, response, improvisation, and accidental permanence, through people under pressure making desperate decisions that happen to work just barely well enough to survive the immediate problem. And then time passes, the crisis fades, the emergency becomes history, but the fix remains, no longer questioned, no longer justified, simply how we've always done it. You think about all the medieval emergencies that created modern systems. Quarantine, keeping ships offshore until disease revealed itself or didn't. Bureaucracy, documenting reality so disputes could be resolved with records instead of violence.
Standard time synchronizing human activity so emergencies could be met with coordination instead of chaos. Public sanitation, removing waste so plague found fewer opportunities to spread. Fire codes, mandating expensive materials so cities stopped burning quite so completely. Hospitals, isolating the sick so disease couldn't travel as efficiently. Uniforms, making authority recognizable so orders could be followed during crisis. None of them were elegant, none were perfectly designed, none emerged from calm, rational analysis of optimal solutions. All of them were born from fear, panic, and the desperate need to prevent disaster from becoming extinction. But they persisted, they evolved, they improved.
The emergency scaffolding became permanent architecture. The temporary fixes became eternal systems. The desperate improvisations became sacred traditions that people defend without knowing why, except that changing them feels dangerous and maintaining them feels safe. This is your legacy. Not the crises themselves, but the solutions they forced into existence. Not the disasters, but the systems built to survive them. Not the emergencies, but the infrastructure that emerged from them and refused to leave. A woman passes, carrying bread from the market. She walks on clean streets, lit by lamps, moving according to time announced by bells, protected by guards in visible uniforms, living in a city that maintains records and inspects buildings and quarantines ships and isolates disease. She has no idea that every one of these systems started as someone's desperate guess during a crisis. The city settles into night. Bells ring curfew. Guards patrol visible routes. Hospitals tend the sick in isolation. Buildings stand fire-resistant. Streets remain clean. Ships wait offshore. Records document everything. All of it emergency fixes. All of it permanent now. You walk home through streets that are safer, cleaner, more organized than they were a century ago. Not because anyone planned this magnificent infrastructure, because enough emergencies forced enough desperate solutions that accidentally worked, and working solutions are too valuable to question, even when they're based on medieval guessing and historical panic. Somewhere, centuries in the future, people will live inside these systems without knowing their origins. They will complain about bureaucracy requiring documentation. They will resent quarantine delays. They will find fire codes restrictive. They will consider sanitation and hospitals and standard time and visible authority to be obvious necessities that have always existed. They will never know they're living inside emergency fixes. They will assume everything was designed intentionally by wise planners with comprehensive understanding. They will forget that most of civilization is held together by desperate improvisations that happen to work and never got replaced because working is sufficient and perfection is expensive. But you know, standing here in 1480, watching your city settle into routines that were once revolutionary, you understand the truth that history textbooks will forget. The emergency fixes worked. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but adequately. And adequate solutions that prevent disaster become permanent through sheer inertia, because who volunteers to dismantle the thing that's keeping everyone alive? And so the temporary becomes eternal. The desperate becomes traditional. The improvised becomes institutional. And centuries later, people point to these systems and say, this is how civilized societies function, never knowing they're describing organized panic that accidentally succeeded. You reach your home as darkness settles completely over the city. Inside, there is warmth, food, the comfort of private space after a day of public responsibility. You sit quietly and think about tomorrow, which will probably involve similar work. More systems to maintain, more emergencies to address, more temporary solutions that will become permanent whether anyone intends them to or not. This is the rhythm of civilization. Crisis forces innovation. Innovation becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes invisible. And invisible systems support everything until they fail, at which point everyone asks why no one planned better, forgetting that the planning was done during the previous crisis by people who were terrified and guessing. And so, like the medieval official after a day of preventing disasters and implementing desperate solutions that became permanent traditions, you too can rest now, knowing that history continues its gentle rhythm, held together by people who accepted that adequacy under pressure beats perfection that never arrives. The emergency fixes worked, and they never went away. They're still working, still supporting civilization, still preventing the chaos they were designed to contain. Sleep well. Tomorrow there will be new emergencies, new temporary solutions, new permanent traditions being born from crisis. This is how we've always done it, and this is how we'll keep doing it, because emergency fixes that work become the architecture of forever. Sleep well.